Thanks for tuning in to Wine Blast. Sign up to Wine Blast Plus for first-class subscriber-only content to access our full archive, support the show and get every episode before it goes on free release. You'll also get subscriber-only discounts with the likes of Corvin, Jancis Robinson Glassware and Academy du Vin Library. Just visit wineblast.co.uk or click the link in the show notes. Hello and welcome to Wine Blast. It's great to have you with us. And you really don't want to miss this one because we're tackling what one well-informed Wine Blast Plus subscriber described to us as the misunderstood, much maligned and confusing issue of natural wine.
Yes, hello, welcome. Thanks for joining. We are indeed diving into the fast-flowing rapids of natural wine. It's timely. And it's a wild ride. What even is natural wine these days? Have we reached peak natural wine? Is it effectively dead in the water? Or is natural wine thriving and set to keep growing? And perhaps there's another way of seeing natural wine's evolution, which sits somewhere between these positions and is actually a bit more nuanced and interesting when it comes to the future of wine in general. Either way, here's a taster of what's coming up.
Natural wine is actually exploding. People who make natural wine often live as if it is 150 years ago, especially in this day and age when everything is really saturated with AI. We should take any romanticism we can possibly get.
And the whole thing can get very religious, and people who are, they've got their yoga mat in one hand and their no sulfites please badge in the other. It's made people think. It's made the wider wine industry think about how we make wine, how we work in vineyards. We've had a massive broadening of what I would call well-made real wine.
And I really believe that the best quality wines that I can make will have a little bit more of a touch than they used to when they were made naturally. So maybe natural wine isn't dead, but it certainly seems like the zeitgeist is definitely dissipated.
So getting spicy already. We heard there from writer and winemaker Rachel Signer, journalist Simon Woolf and wine producer Ben Walgate. More from them all in due course. We also have some discounts to offer you associated with our brilliant guests, so keep your ears tuned for those. Most of all, we're going to have a proper debate because my instinct is that you and I are not going to see eye to eye on this one.
Your hunch is almost certainly correct, as many a heated late-night discussion will attest. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. We need to start at the beginning, as ever. Now, you may already have listened to our pretty popular episode on natural wine from season 3. If you haven't already, do. We hear from natural wine champion Isabelle Legeron, MW, and how she had hate mail and other things early on. It's absolutely fascinating. But if not, let's begin with what natural wine is.
Yes, so we'll discuss this with our interviewees, but essentially, natural wine is a broad brush term that generally refers to wines grown organically or biodynamically, then made with a low intervention philosophy, typically small scale, often family-owned wineries, usually using very few treatments or additions and low levels of the multi-purpose preservative sulfur dioxide or SO2 or sulfites.
Yeah, it stands in defiant opposition to what natural wine fans say are mass-produced wines grown using a host of systemic pesticides, fungicides and herbicides, and then heavily manipulated in the winery. Natural wine began in the 1980s as essentially a protest movement about standardization and homogenization in the wine world. Became very popular, especially with younger anti-establishment free spirits, and has since evolved as an ecosystem that now encompasses dedicated wine bars, retailers, distributors, and legions of dedicated fans around the world.
But the question now is, what next for natural wine? Was it just a paradigm shift, a temporary vector or trend that helped instigate or catalyse necessary change in the wine world, but which will end up becoming redundant as the world moves on? Or is it evolving, adapting, growing, and perhaps, whisper it, being partly subsumed into the conventional wine blob, albeit with positive implications?
So these are the big questions we want to tackle in this episode. And who better to start answering than Rachel Signer, whose brand new book, How to Drink Natural Wine, has just been published by Mitchell Beasley. By way of context, Rachel started out as a fiction writer with a background in cultural anthropology. She got into wine by accident, accident working in a restaurant in New York City that championed natural wine. She went on to found a print magazine focused on natural wine called Pipette, wrote a memoir, You Had Me at Pet Nat, and ended up living in the Adelaide Hills in Australia, writing and making natural wine, which is where she was when we spoke, having banished, incidentally, her poor husband and daughter to the pub so we could have peace and quiet.
Yeah. So there is a nice link here with our previous episode where we touched on the vibrant natural wine scene in the Adelaide Hills. Check it out if you haven't heard that one yet. By way of recent update, we believe Rachel isn't currently making wine because of a bad back, the work being very physical. The family are also going on an extended sabbatical to Italy, which sounds delightful.
Yeah, we did ask Rachel about the title of her book, How to Drink Natural Wine. She said, it's a real question people have, especially the younger generations. The category is interesting. It's also reasonably expensive. So people need a little advice to get them on this journey discovering this fascinating category of wine.
She also describes natural wine as special. And I asked her, what makes it special?
I still remember the first time I tasted a natural wine. And the flavors were not like anything I had ever experienced. There was a tiny bit of spritz. There was an earthiness that reminded me specifically of the tomatoes my mother grew in our backyard. And the actual fruit profile, like the actual profile of, it was a Gamay from Olivier Cousin. It was just more intense than any experience that I'd ever had with wine. I guess I think that's special. I think that's special that this romantic, old-fashioned way of making wine can produce something so unique year after year. Because if I tried that exact wine 5 years later, it could be really quite different. The way it captures not just the time and the place, but also, interestingly, the personality of the maker. I think that's quite special. And when I tasted it, something really changed in me, something happened, and I just went down the rabbit hole.
Now, we all know natural wine has different aspects to it. For you, what are the most important ones?
I think that organic plus viticulture is by far the most important. And why I say organic plus, it's not that it must be organic certified or it must be a specific kind of organic. It needs to be that there is organic farming plus something. So plus regenerative soil work, or plus thinking about how to reduce electricity usage or reduce plastic waste. I think that the essential component of sustainably farming land that grows the wine is of the utmost importance.
And how has the natural wine category evolved in recent years? You call it a wild global journey after it was initially dismissed as a fleeting trend. Where is it now, given it's become fairly well established now around the world?
It's growing and it's super exciting. Natural wine is actually exploding. There are increasingly new producers in all sorts of regions, even regions where you wouldn't expect they would be making natural wine, such as Japan or in Brazil, Mexico, and the Valley of Guadalupe. I think that natural wine has exploded in terms of how many young people are giving it a go and just trying to find a little patch of land or find a mentor or find a way that they can live this lifestyle, because it's really beautiful to make this kind of wine. And there are also amazing new communities popping up about natural wine. And so I do think that there's a really nice welcoming aspect to natural wine culture right now. And I hope that the book fits right into that as well.
Because you do write, exploring natural wine is a social process. And as you say, there are wine fairs. There are lots of natural wine fairs and events. Is natural wine just as much about being part of a tribe, a community, or a form of self-expression as it is about the wine itself, do you think?
Some of the most fascinating people I know are in the world of natural wine. Whether they're making it or they're on the distribution side, it's an incredible just collection of eclectic individuals. And in that sense, it's a wonderful community, and exploring natural wine is a great way to meet a lot of different people who, by the way, don't always have backgrounds in wine. I always say that the best way to explore a genre like natural wine is to form a tasting group with friends. It lowers the cost barrier a lot. And then eventually you can also get into things like blind tasting. And I had one of those groups in New York City, and it's like my core memories of my late 20s is getting together with these people, and we would just talk for hours about the wines. We couldn't talk about them enough. And I think it's really beautiful. People are on their phones a lot these days. And if you have a few nice wines open, I think you can just put your phones down and really get into it, talk about the place, and have a conversation.
Some winemakers we've talked to are moderating how naturally they make their wines, for example, using a bit more sulfur or filtering, but still aiming to make wines that are essentially low-tech, artisanal, traditional in style. What's your take on that?
There is a spectrum, and it's really important to recognize that. And it's important not to be exclusionary. And I have respect for anyone that makes authentic wine. Anything that's not trucks of juice coming in and then machines making the wine, because that does exist. Anything that's about human touch and place is really, really beautiful. However, on a personal level, I'm always going to be very attracted to wines that are made entirely with grapes. And I just find that they can be so exceptionally good that it's forever interesting to explore that very specific genre. But I don't think anyone should, there's no need within the kind of movement of natural wine to make judgment. I do think it's good if winemakers say what they're doing. For example, I can think of one producer in southern France that's kind of in the natural wine scene, and their New York importer is a big natural wine importer. And they have always stated very clearly on their website that they use a particulate filtration. So not like a sterile filtration. They get the matter out of their wines because their wines had too much matter and they didn't want to release them with sediment. I think it's just really good that the information's out there. By contrast, I can think of a beloved winemaker who started out making entirely natural wines, only grapes, and the volatile acidity was quite high. 10 years later, he's adding fairly significant sulfite additions, and he's never come out publicly and said it, and none of his distributors have. And I just feel that it is really good to state clearly what you're doing if you change.
Now, you describe natural wine in your introduction to the book as non-commercial, anti-corporate, and a return to the peasant roots of winemaking. Is there a risk that natural wine overly romanticizes wine production?
I don't see any reason why not to make it as romantic as it possibly can be. The people I've met who make natural wine are so extraordinarily romantic. People who make natural wine often live as if it is 150 years ago. I know that they're using Instagram, but there are plenty of natural winemakers using horses to till their vineyards. Goutegau is one, Francois Saint-Lô is another. I think that, especially in this day and age, when everything is really saturated with AI, I think we should take any romanticism we can possibly get. People who write by hand, people who weave, people who make wine with a horse and a wooden basket press. So I actually love to celebrate this romanticism.
Rachel, how do you see the future for natural wines?
I suspect we are going to see hybrids becoming more favored by natural wine producers. I think that we're going to see people working with varieties that are not 100% vitis vinifera to try to combat the way climate change is ruining harvests year after year. I'm thinking of, for example, Romain de Groot in Beaujolais, who makes a wine entirely planted from his own vineyard of hybrids, in Beaujolais, hybrids. And I'm thinking as well of wine in the United States and wine in the UK and Canada, and these cooler climates becoming increasingly interesting and increasingly able to ripen grapes. And I'm hoping that there's a lot of research out there about creating hybrids that can withstand climate change. I also just think we need to be doing more to think about climate change in general. And that would just mean regenerative agriculture, thinking about ways to give back to the soil, and also perhaps being more part of a local economy and exporting wine less.
Rachel, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susie. This was really fun. I really appreciated it.
So hybrids, that's interesting.
I know, yeah.
Something we have discussed before on the pod back in season 6, wasn't it? The vines of the future are here. I mean, it makes sense. If natural wine is first and foremost about being sustainable in the vineyard, a point Rachel highlights, then having vines that need fewer treatments because they've been bred that way is logical, I guess.
I also liked her organic plus idea, because one thing we've said before is that organics poorly done can have some pretty bad results, more tractor emissions and copper in the soil, because you can treat with sulfur and copper sulfate in organic viticulture, or you can get organic wines in really heavy bottles, which again means more carbon emissions, which seems crazy. And she mentioned regenerative viticulture, which is a lot about prioritizing soil health, and it's becoming a big thing in wine, but which isn't necessarily part of organic policy.
Yeah, so being mindful of the bigger sustainability picture, really important. One thing that does trouble me, though, and I'm interested here, is this danger of over-romanticising natural wine. I mean, I love her point that we need some romance in the world. Absolutely.
Yep.
There's a place for traditional artisans who embrace historic practices. Fine. In a world, especially in a world that's increasingly technological. But I also think that can easily become or tip over into sort of stubborn dogma or refusal to engage with the latest knowledge or science, when it actually could be helpful, all round.
I mean, she did point out the irony, didn't she? Saying that some producers live like it's 1870, but are big on Instagram. Yeah. And it would be lovely if natural wine can engage new generations and get people passionate about wine and get them off their phones. But so much of the communication about this new wave stuff is online or on phones. But what did you think about her point about natural wine being a spectrum and not being exclusionary?
Yeah, I don't know about you. I thought she was spot on there, particularly about the importance of transparency. I think the future of natural wine is people being honest and open about what they're doing, being positive about what they do, not critical about what other people are doing, embracing their point on the spectrum for authentic reasons, not excluding others, telling those stories and finding their audience on that basis and being welcoming, not a sort of tribal community.
I did love her story about that formative wine and then going down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
In the book, she says it was like the moment in The Wizard of Oz when the film suddenly turns to colour, something truly wild. And good wine can do that.
Yeah.
And when it happens, it is beautiful. In the book, Rachel highlights the important ritual role of wine in ancient cultures, and it's really important right now when wine has so many critics that these wonderfully positive aspects of wine are recognised and championed, and natural wine can clearly do that.
Yeah, I'd argue conventional wine can do that too, but
well, fair enough.
The key point is the two don't have to be binary, do they? They don't have to be polar opposites. There's more that unites them than divides them, which is the perfect moment, I think, for a quick break. To recap so far, natural wine is evolving, and as it does, it's changing wine as we know it. The question is, where does it go from here?
So we've featured Rachel Signer and her brand new book, How to Drink Natural Wine, which is out now and for which we can offer you, our loyal listeners, 25% off. Just check out our show notes for the discount code and link. Next up, we're chatting with writer and friend of the pod, Simon Woolf, an expert on natural and orange wine, who's published a couple of books and who writes on the Substack, themorningclaret.com, which we'd definitely recommend, and for which we also have a 25% discount. We'll put that on the show notes too.
Discount crazy. Here we go. Wine blast. Anyway, some great stuff there. Now, Simon first got into natural wine 15 years ago when he started tasting them, and he said they just had this energy to them, a va-va-voom that took me by surprise and was quite shocking at first. He says it's like food. The less you muck around with it, the more exciting it potentially tastes. I asked Simon what the most important aspects of natural wine are for him.
I think the most important, and maybe the one that is most poorly understood and sidelined by a lot of people who drink natural wine, is the farming. You know, to me, good wine, wine made without additives, has to start with top quality, healthy grapes. And if you're spraying synthetic chemicals, God knows what, fertilizers, pesticides all over the place, there's no way that you're going to be successful making anything that I would call natural wine.
And why is a big, difficult question, I know, but why is natural wine so contentious?
Yeah, I ask myself this question all the time, and I think it's sadly comes down to terminology. I think this phrase, which we can talk about, and we can talk about where that came from and why it might be quite a ridiculous phrase, it really got people's backs up, because I think the first thing people would ask, well, if you're calling what you do natural wine, then that implies that what I do is unnatural wine. So I think it got people's backs up because there was a certain amount of preaching at the beginning. You know, that natural wine has had and still has its acolytes, and the whole thing can get very religious, you know, and people who are, you know, they've got their yoga mat in one hand and their no sulfites please badge in the other, you know. So
do you not? Sorry to interrupt, but would you put yourself in that club or not?
No, I wouldn't. I mean, I'm quite open-minded. I think natural wine it's a standard to aim for. You know, for me, it's a curve. I just want to drink stuff that's been messed around with and processed as little as possible. I think the one non-negotiable for me is the farming, though. I really don't want to drink wine that's been sprayed with pesticides. I mean, these are grapes, you know, and if they're red wines or orange wines, the skins are in there, you know, there are residues, and you know, obviously, Peter, as you know, my body is a temple, you know, and I'd just rather not have those things floating around inside me if I can avoid it.
And I wouldn't like to have those things floating around inside you either, as you say. You're an object lesson physically to the rest of the trade. But just let's get on. I want to ask you a bit more about this, the origin of the term natural wine, because, of course, it can be divisive, as you've said. But there's a really interesting couple of points to be made about the origin of the nomenclature, isn't there? Oh,
yeah. I mean, this is where it gets really interesting. I mean, if you most people would date the movement back to the 1980s, you know, when the work of Jules Chauvet and his colleagues and the Gang of Five really sort of put these ideas of making wine with spontaneous ferments and making wine without added sulfites or very low sulfites. They put all these ideas on the map. And then you started seeing these wines put up for sale in Paris initially. You know, I think that's really where, if we talk about a movement, that's where it kicked off. And I think that, you know, the terms that, you know, anyone who visited Paris in, let's say, the 90s, they'll remember you had these venues popping up, little places called Cave à vin sans soufre, you know, a place where you can buy wines without sulfites. Or people would, you know, they'd sometimes call them vin nature, vin naturel. But vin nature, somewhere along the way, got mistranslated. It's a false friend in French. And it doesn't mean natural. It means without additives. You know, it's like the example I always use, and I have to thank Andrew Jefford, a much smarter man than me, because he suggested this analogy. You know, yogurt nature is yogurt without fruit, without sugar, without anything. And vin nature in its initial form, it was this idea that you could make wine without adding anything, without adding yeast, without adding sulfites, without adding enzymes, God knows what. So I think we've sort of been left with a mistranslation that, to a certain extent, has cooked the movement's goose.
Simon, how has the natural wine category evolved in recent years?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's evolved in multiple directions, and obviously it's become massively popular, especially with a younger generation of wine drinkers. Natural wine is drunk by millions of people around the globe, and there's a whole ecosystem of wine fairs, winemakers, importers that didn't exist 20 years ago. But I think with that popularity, of course, have come problems. I think there are still people that want to discredit the movement. There are big wine, if we can call it that, still gets quite annoyed with natural wine because people can be very, they can be very sanctimonious sometimes, as if the natural wine movement, natural wine is the only thing and everything else is rubbish. So I think there are still people who want to damn it. I think maybe the biggest problem, though, that I've seen more and more is consumers, maybe wine professionals as well, having this fixed idea in their head that natural wine means a particular style. And this is something that I speak with people about endlessly. And people say, well, the problem is everybody thinks natural wine, it's glue reds, weird orange wines with raspy tannins, and just wines that have off smells. They smell like vinegar and they taste like cider. And people, they want to pigeonhole it. They want to, they imagine these cliches, and that has led to an ever increasing number of winemakers, even sometimes bar restaurant owners, saying, I don't want anything to do with this term anymore because it's hurting me.
Interesting. And how do you see the process going from here? Will natural wine and the community keep growing in appeal and importance, or have we reached peak natural wine?
I mean, everybody keeps saying we've reached peak natural wine, and then it keeps growing. But I think I would see the natural wine movement. You have a small core at the natural wine movement, and it's a kind of agitator. It's made people think. It's made the wider wine industry think about how we make wine, how we work in vineyards. And I think a lot of those findings, a lot of those philosophical constructs they've kind of leaked out. They've that's the wrong word. I'm trying to think of a more positive word. They've propagated across the entire industry. And I think in general, I don't think it's an exaggeration to say that without the natural wine movement, we maybe wouldn't have seen the massive decrease in sulfite usage that we see now versus 20 or 30 years ago. So I think, to me, in a way, the natural wine movement has already proved its point. I think what you now have is all of these in-between zones. You have people who are on a curve. They're like, well, they've realised they don't need to add yeast. They've realised they can work with less sulfites. They've realised they can back away from herbicides and pesticides in the vineyard. Maybe they're still a little bit risk averse, and they wouldn't go quite as far as some of the radicals would. Bit of temperature control, bit of filtration. But I think you have all of these natural adjacent areas in wine now. And people have come up with very creative ways of talking about them. It's artisanal, it's low intervention, it's what have you. So that, to me, is very important, because we've had a massive broadening of what I would call well-made real wine.
That's really interesting. I mean, is there also a place for consistency, reliability and accessibility in wine, like the kind that the bigger, let's say, supermarket brands provide?
I think there is, and to be honest, I think a good natural grower also understands that. And many of the winemakers that I love, I mean, they work in a smart way. I think smart business sense when you're a winemaker is, okay, my entry-level cuvées, I'm going to make sure that they are consistent year in, year out. A, because they're the wine that I sell the most of, and B, because they're the wines that are going to be maybe drunk by a more unassuming crowd. So I think consistency is important right across the board. I think it's arrogant and stupid from a business sense of a winemaker to not make any attempt to be consistent. But at the same time, especially as you go higher up the price range, maybe, single vineyard cuvées, something like that, then I think there is more acceptance that we really do want to taste the year. And the kind of people who will be buying those more premium wines don't accept the same consistency. So yes, I think consistency is important, but it doesn't, it doesn't have to be right across the board. No, if you buy, Grand Cru, Bordeaux or Burgundy, you'd be a bit disappointed if every year tasted the same.
And you mentioned business sense. The commercial aspect of winemaking isn't something that often gets discussed too much, but obviously it's hugely important that a business can sustain itself. There's also seems to be some attitudes in the natural wine world that it should be, maybe it's slightly romanticized, and that there's no place for corporate players or that sort of commercial side of things. Where do you stand on that?
Yeah, I think it's ridiculous to a certain extent. I think maybe it's difficult to draw a line. I have heard people express the view that if your winery, if your estate becomes big enough that you start to need employees outside the family, then you're not making natural wine. I think that's ridiculous. I think that's far too far romanticized, and I think actually many of the world's most iconic natural winemakers, a lot of the Austrians spring to mind, people like Good Orgau, or you have La Stoppa in Emilia-Romagna. These are actually quite big operations these days. They're hugely successful, and they're successful because they understand how business works. They understand how to market themselves. I think, though, there is a wealth of difference between, a Gallo brothers and a family-led estate making quarter of a million, 500,000 bottles a year. And the motivation is usually different. I think if the motivation is to corner the market, to dominate, to be on every supermarket shelf, that's very different than the motivation to be good stewards of the land, to make the best wine that you possibly could. And I'm not saying that people in big corporate wines maybe don't also think these things at some stage, but I think there is a fundamentally different motivation. And if there is a dividing line, then it's going to be that, why did you start making wine? I think as soon as people mention the word brand, then I start to suspect.
Depends on your definition of brand, then, I suppose, doesn't it? But let's not get into that. Yeah. Simon, how do you see the future for natural wine?
Yeah, it's such a tough question, isn't it? With the wine is under such a lot of flack right now. It's been dragged into the big alcohol arena. The anti-alcohol league is trying to make it even more restricted than it already is. And I think these are the problems that we have to solve right now. And in a way, natural wine is an important part of this conversation. I think maybe it's important because it's a more premium sector in wine. And I think that's the way that wine has to go. When you look at what's going on right now, I think it's the bulk producers of wine that are having the hardest time because the bottom is dropping out of that part of the market. So I think there is a very positive future for natural wine. I would just really like to remove the sort of ghetto element of it as much as possible. And I think it's happened to a certain extent. And I hope that it will continue to happen. I hope that we could talk about points on a curve rather than everything has to be binary all the time.
Simon, thank you very much indeed.
Pleasure. Thank you, Peter.
He's such a reasonable chap, Simon, isn't he? And a good writer. Yeah. Again, like Rachel, he talks about points on a curve or spectrum, not just binary opposition. And his point about the term natural wine essentially being an unfortunate mistranslation, which has got a lot of people's backs up unnecessarily. That's intriguing, isn't it?
It is. It's a brilliant, absolutely brilliant point. Very well made. And Rachel made a similar point. They both suggested alternatives like minimal intervention or lo-fi or real or authentic wine, but they both conceded, as I think we probably would, that natural wine, has kind of won out for better or worse, and we're kind of stuck with it. I mean, what Simon raises, and this is more relevant to my mind, is the way that some natural wine acolytes, I think that's his word, can then be, preachy or dogmatic. And this is what inflames the conflict and tension. And there are two areas that I'd highlight here, particularly criticising conventional wine and then flaws or faults.
Go on.
Okay, you can see me getting on my high horse. He's just sort of battening down the hatches. Okay,
standing on your box.
I think it's fine if natural producers do their thing, lead by example. If you want to farm organically and use minimal additives or processing agents, brilliant, fantastic. But I think it's profoundly unhelpful to then lob bombs at conventional producers in ways that are sometimes, unfair or overdone, by implying that all or most conventional wine is mass-produced slop or utterly lobotomized from using hundreds of additives and processing agents, or that all additives and treatments are designed to make a wine taste totally homogenized. That may be true of a very small minority, but it is a gross generalization, and it crops up all too often. There are many wines that aren't natural that still express terroir and vintage and are very fine wines.
But the point of principle still stands, doesn't it? Vineyard sprays can ruin ecosystems and degrade soils. There is a very long list of additives or processing agents allowed in wine, which don't then usually have to be on the label. I mean, we'd ideally like all wine producers to be more sustainable, more transparent and less interventionist, wouldn't we?
Yeah, of course. But it's the preachy and dogmatic criticism that rankles, I think, particularly when people aren't winemakers. They don't have that hands-on practical experience. Look, live and let live should be the philosophy to my mind. Not all treatments or additives are inherently bad by any means either. But anyway, the second point I wanted to come on to is when it comes to flaws or faults in wine, something we, of course, explored with the brilliant Sietze Weimar in Tainted Love from season 6. That was a fun episode to do. But, I profoundly disagree with the relativism on this that some parts of the natural wine community condone. They say, faults, flaws, they're just part of the authenticity of a wine, or its kind of earthy, rustic charm. One journal I read called faulty wine punk rock winemaking.
Yeah, but I mean...
Come on.
I think we need to be a bit more open-minded about this. Be honest. We often like a wine with a bit of edge, with a bit of funk. Technically proficient and squeaky clean wines can be really boring. A touch of Brettanomyces or Brett can give meaty, gamey complexity, and that's fun. A bit of controlled oxidation can make a wine much more interesting and edgy. Volatile acidity or VA can sometimes lift a wine's aromatics.
Okay, listen, I agree. Fair point, well made, 100%. But we come back to that spectrum, So here's a quote. I want to get your take on it. Here's a quote I've got from a natural winemaker. Okay, not adding sulfites is partly about embracing the fact that the wine is not yours to control, and about acknowledging its right to self-determination, philosophically speaking. What do you think about that statement?
I think I respect the dedication and the aspiration, but I can see where the potential problems lie.
Yeah, quite. It's for me, it's very simple. In the technical terminology, it's complete bollocks.
I thought you might say something.
Come on. What is the job of a winemaker other than to make a palatable beverage? No? I mean, if you need to use sulfites because otherwise your wine is going to taste like shit, use sulfites. I mean, you wouldn't tolerate a cheesemaker selling you rancid cheese or a butcher selling you putrid meat, or if your pilot crashes the plane because that was its destiny, philosophically speaking. So TCA or halo taint, makes a wine faulty, no question. And that's not just from corks, by the way. Mousiness is a clear fault, even though many natural wine fans apparently disagree. These wines are spoiled. They're, objectively speaking, disgusting. How many people will be put off wine for life by trying a faulty wine like this that tastes disgusting and thinking it's normal? That's a key point. Okay, a little bit of oxidation or Brett can work. I will concede that, But the key, though, as you said, is the word controlled. You need a winemaker who knows what they're doing. The problem with Brett is, of course, as we know, if it gets into bottles unchecked, some bottles may be good, but some may be terrible. So it's about being able to give people assurances over quality. That's kind of baseline standard now if you're selling a product.
Yeah. I mean, Rachel actually made the point that making natural wine is not for amateurs. She stressed that to make good low intervention wine, you really need to know what you're doing and have a good mentor. I mean, she told the story about ruining a batch of perfectly good Chardonnay by fermenting it too hot and wild, and it was ruined by VA, but she still tried to sell it, which was a big mistake. Now she uses it apparently to braise her osso bucco. Anyway, I get the feeling the debate on flaws and faults will rumble on.
I think it may do. Please feel free to send in your comments. But, you know, Simon talked about sulfites as like the winemaker being a good parent. If the child, or wine in this case, is going off the rails, you intervene judiciously to end up creating a wine, and I quote, that is more enjoyable for everyone. I think we'd all agree that's a good thing. But he added that too much SO2 can be like a facelift or Botox, I guess. He says it freezes a wine in time and makes it less expressive.
He also stressed the fact that natural wine is a philosophy, not a style. You know, he defines it as expect the unexpected, which can be shocking or surprising, partly because wine has, as he puts it, become more technology-driven and interventionist, whereas natural wine can be rawer, more rootsy, a little unkempt. But then can't we all? Life's just like that, as he says. But he was at pains to stress natural wine isn't just glue reds and orange whites. You know, for him, it's about good farming and minimal intervention or additions.
I thought it was really interesting on how natural wine has influenced mainstream wine to minimise vineyard sprays, to reduce sulfite additions. So now we have lots of what he says are natural adjacent styles. He says it's been a sea change in conventional wine spurred by natural wine. And clearly he thinks natural wine has a bright future, you know, as part of wine's premium mix in the fight against declining consumption and the anti-alcohol lobby.
Just hopefully with less polarisation about it. So now we should bring in our final guest, English winemaker Ben Walgate. Ben comes from a long line of farmers in Yorkshire. He got into wine temping for Majestic while at university. He then travelled in Europe and Burgundy before training at Plumpton and working in various roles in the English wine industry, including publicly listed corporation Gusbourne and then Tillingham, which he describes as his more natural, experimental phase.
He sounds like a rock star, doesn't he? Going through a sort of,
So, he is a bit like a rock star.
I suppose there's a lot of crossover. I think it's fair to say that Ben has hands-on experience of both ends of the wine spectrum, natural and conventional. So a very interesting mind to pick. In 2023, he set up his own négociant winemaking project, Woolgate, with a winery in Rye, East Sussex, and buying fruit, mainly Pinot Noir and Chardonnay, from growers in East Anglia and Essex. The interesting thing about Woolgate is it's kind of a new wave fusion winery. Ben describes it as bridging two defining movements in modern English wine: the technical precision of large-scale sparkling production and the regenerative ecosystem-led philosophy of contemporary low-intervention winemaking.
Note the absence of the term natural there. So is this the third way for wine, bringing together a bit of natural with a bit of conventional to find a positive compromise? Ben says when he started down the natural wine route, he was very naive, romantic and dewy-eyed. But as he says, there was a sort of poetry to it that really enticed me. He admits to making mistakes at Tillingham, taking things to extremes, which sometimes paid off. They got listings at Noma and did pretty well generally, but also sometimes didn't.
So how has he changed now? He's not natural because he buys in grapes, some from non-organic vineyards. Plus, he says he doesn't want to call himself natural because it comes with, and I quote, a whole set of problems on quality and faults I want to distance myself from. So what's he aiming to do?
It's like when you meet a vegan and the first thing they tell you is they're a vegan. It's like, I want you to meet me and enjoy my wines as you find them. I don't want to ram it down your throat that they're made one way or another. You know, there are fine wines that exist in the world that might be biodynamic and they might be vegan, but you'd never know, right? And I think that's the point. The point is I want the wines to do the talking first. I don't want the dogma to be the first thing that hits you in the face. But I suppose in the winery where there's the most sort of, the movement is away from more rigid natural wine methods has sort of shifted. And it's from the experience that I've had over the last few years of wanting the wines to be the best that they can be. And I think in the beginning there was this naivety that if anything that you added or any interventions you made in the winery detracted from their sort of essential truth, the quality that they arrived in from the vineyard. Okay, that can work, but in a lot of cases it can go wrong. And you can get rogue characters coming in from whether it's lactic bacteria or rogue yeasts. You can get Brett, you can get volatile acidity. There's all of these pathways that the wine can go down. And not necessarily in a major way, even in a very subtle way. I think they actually get in the way of the wine's quality. And I think there's in some quarters with natural wine, there's a novelty to those faults, which makes the wines kind of endearing. But I think ultimately there's too much inconsistency and too much variability, and I really believe that the best quality wines that I can make will have a little bit more of a touch than they used to when they were made naturally. So examples would be we're maybe being a bit cleaner with the juice, not taking quite so many solids into the tank. We might, in some cases, where there's a question mark about fruit quality, we might introduce a little bit of sulfur at harvest time. And then beyond that, we maybe look to include a little bit more sulfur at first racking in the spring. And we're maybe moving towards doing a very, very, very light filtration, what I call like a rock blocker, nothing near sterile, something that can just give the wines a bit more clarity, especially with the whites. But personally, it's just that fine-tuning and just tweaking the wine and giving them a bit more finesse.
Yeah. Do you think you've lost anything? And presumably you've gained things as well.
I don't think I think we're only gaining. We might lose some purist followers who feel that we're maybe selling out, because inevitably there are going to be people who take that position. But I think I've always stuck to my guns. I've always done what I felt was right for my wines. And I really feel that, say, for example, in 2022, and those wines are selling through now, and we're about to move to 2023. Some of those wines, I wish I'd done things a little bit differently. The way I'm really proud of them, but I think if I'd made them a little bit differently, they'd be more approachable now, and people would have got much more enjoyment out of them. I might have got more awards if I'd made the wines in a way where they were more ready to drink and more accessible. Whereas the 23s, changed the approach a little bit, longer time in the cellar, longer bottle conditioning before release, and those wines off the bat are much, much more approachable and much easier to drink. So it's a combination of a growth in experience, but also tweaking the winemaking approach as well.
Because you've said in the past that some of your full-on natural wines were, and I quote, sort of less accessible, therefore often misunderstood or overlooked.
And some of them were crap. No, I mean, so I did make some wines I'm really pleased with, and I've kept some of those ones from 2017, the inaugural vintage at Tillingham, and they really, even with zero sulfur and coming from low alcohol and stuff, some of them are resplendent now. There was 105 wines over 6 vintages, so that's quite a lot. So within that, there were probably half a dozen cuvées of wines which were very, very experimental and with zero sulfur. They developed faults in the bottle and they weren't very good. So yeah, I think I asked a lot of some of the people who came to Tillingham, and obviously the people who came were already natural line winistas and very much sort of drinking the natural wine Kool-Aid. We're all like, this is great, we love it. But some people would never have picked up a bottle of Tillingham again after some of the experiences they might have had.
And just looking at making wine in the UK, the reality of making wine in the UK, what is it that's particularly challenging if you want to take the full natural wine route?
There's no real challenges to making it. I'd caution that there's already quite a few, I probably could name a dozen wine brands that are working in that sort of natural space. And I think it's quite hard. I think it's a niche market within a niche market. And how much is it true to say that, natural wines had its moment? I think it's a lot harder now than it was, say, 5 years ago to sell those wines, especially at the price they need to command. And that's a challenge in general for English wine, is the cost of production is incredibly high. And that, combined with our domestic tax duty, makes the wines incredibly expensive, and we're not by any means on a level playing field with our competition, whether that's in Europe or elsewhere. So it's a very, very tricky game. And I think if I didn't have a very successful hospitality side hustle going on, it would be next to impossible to make any money doing what I do unless you get to a certain scale.
And what are the things you would never compromise on?
I'll always want my wines to have their je ne sais quoi. They're part of me. That's a non-negotiable, right? And there's my recipe is my recipe, and I'm never going to sort of throw that out the window and sort of start adopting a winemaking approach or style just to cash in on it. I'm never also going to turn my back on trying to find growers who are ticking the boxes for me in terms of, what they're doing in the vineyards and how sustainable that is. And, the dream would be to move to having, 100% control of my own production and my own vineyards and farming those regeneratively and in the best possible way that they could be farmed. And that's one thing I sorely miss from no longer having my own vineyards, which is obviously a big part of what Tillingham meant. So those are the things I wouldn't do, and the things I'd love to have, as I said, would be those dream vineyards nestled somewhere in North Essex, Suffolk. That's the dream place for me right now.
Looking at the bigger picture, how has the natural wine scene evolved in recent years, and where are we now with natural wine globally?
I'm not following it as closely as I was, but the feedback I'm getting, because I still share, I'm still working with importers who I worked with when the wines tick that natural box more. And the feedback I get from some of them is that market's starting to disappear. Orange wine started to be like, people were past it like a couple of years ago. It's still popular here in my bar. We buy in orange wine because we get asked for it. But a lot of the importers in other countries are saying, well, that's falling by the wayside. And the wines that are presented in a more natural way with the kooky labels designed by the winemaker's children and all that jazz, they're proving very difficult to sell. And I think maybe, that's a sign that maybe it's to do with the financial situation in the world as well, where people are being less adventurous in their tastes. They're drinking things that are more comfortable and more conservative. They're taking less risk with the money that they spend on their wine. So maybe natural wine isn't dead, but it certainly seems like the zeitgeist that Tillingham benefited from is definitely dissipated. So that's my take on it.
So do you think we are going to see an increasing kind of blurring of the lines between natural and conventional wine, where we see that growth of organic farming, minimal intervention, regenerative, but not always hardcore natural? Yeah,
no, I think that would be a great thing, wouldn't it? It would be a great thing. And this isn't just in England, it's in other parts of the wine world as well, where, everything's branded up to the hilt, and it's kind of lacks a bit of soul sometimes. And so I'd like to see people embracing more of that soul and more of the sort of that regenerative farming, diversifying the styles of wines they make as well, taking more risks. Because I think what has always rung true for me or my experience has always been that the more of a story you have to tell about the wines, the easier they are to sell.
And how do you see the future for natural wine?
There's definitely a future for wines that are made with a very light touch in the cellar and that are championing really, really good farming. And I think that's an integral part of what natural wine is. I think where natural wine can struggle is when the dogma gets ahead of the wine quality and where the wine suffers because of a lack of sensitivity from the people who are making it. If they're saying, we're going to not intervene at all costs, and that means that the wine ends up being unpalatable to the consumer, that has no future.
Ben, thank you so much.
Thank you, Susie. It was a pleasure.
I have to say, I 100% agree with Ben on this. The future should be about good farming, being sustainable, wine taking a lead on that, and a light touch in the cellar. But there's no place for dogma or unpalatable or faulty wine in my mind.
I like the notion of wine with soul. Wine with a story.
Yeah, it's good, isn't it?
And yeah, sometimes it's about the people, sometimes it's about rescuing ancestral grape varieties, whatever. But sometimes to change the world, you have to be brave and fearless and stick to your guns.
Fair enough, fair enough. I just think people should do what they believe, do it as well as they possibly can, including intervening as a winemaker where necessary. As Ben said, not all interventions detract from wine quality, whereas some faults do, even at low levels. And then people shouldn't be sort of overly preachy or overly dogmatic. And that also includes the press, by the way.
I mean, interesting what he was saying about English natural wine being a hard sell, especially now, given the cost of living crisis, and questioning whether the buzz had gone out of the natural wine market more generally. Now, we also spoke with winemaker Daniel Ham of Offbeat in Wiltshire, who said he's using a bit more sulphur because, and I quote, consumer preferences have become more conservative and tolerance for high levels of VA or mouse is lower now than during the wild pandemic days.
The wild pandemic days.
He's mindful that his wines aren't cheap and he needs to deliver quality, even if they're low intervention. Meantime, if we accept this isn't just two polarised camps and is actually a spectrum, as both Rachel and Simon encouraged us to do, then this middle ground that Ben and Dan are exploring, perhaps natural adjacent or low intervention, does seem to have a lot to offer.
Yeah, I think it's about horses for courses. There will be people, producers and drinkers, who want hardcore natural wine and they won't compromise. That's okay. Meantime, I think this middle ground will flourish, and the overall result will be to improve standards, improve sustainability, hopefully, make the wine world a better and more delicious place.
So this has been long. We need to wrap things up. By way of closing summary, everyone agrees that natural wine is an imperfect term. But if you take natural wine as a set of aspirations rather than a strict dogma, it's got a lot going for it. Organic farming, low intervention winemaking, a welcoming democratic community, and a sense of fun.
But the preaching and blind dogma have no place in the future of wine. Drinkers deserve palatable wine as a bare minimum, nor is there a place for mudslinging. This is not the time for a vinous civil war. Wine has enough critics and headwinds as it is. Everyone needs to do their own thing and do it well. Wine needs all the friends it can get, whatever the category.
Natural wine started out as essentially a cheeky middle finger to the standardisation and pretentiousness and misguided practices of modern wine. It was timely. It champions wines with soul, wines with attitude, wine with something to say for itself. And there is absolutely a place for that in the wine world of today and the future. Wine can and should be a broad church.
Meantime, it's intriguing to see the emergence of a new category, something of a hybrid in between conventional and natural, as typified by Walgate, among others. Will this perhaps be natural wine's greatest legacy, encouraging big wine to clean up its act and spawning a new generation of postmodern fusion producers? Perhaps. But equally, you sense there will always be a place for people making beautiful, characterful wines with stories to tell, whatever category they belong to.
Thanks to our interviewees Rachel Signer, Simon Woolf and Ben Walgate. Don't forget you can get 25% discounts on both Rachel's new book and Simon's excellent Substack by checking out our show notes. We'll also put links to the previous episodes we mentioned on there. Finally, thanks to you for listening. Until next time, cheers.